in fact, our will is truly completely under our control, that we can do anything we set our minds to. Um, and whenever we experience that disconnect between thinking and willing, that is in fact a mental failure, not, as Aristotle might say, a failure of soul or failure of character. Um, Same thing with judgment. Right? When we judge things incorrectly, it's not that we've been deceived by the external world, but we've failed to use our minds correctly. And most radically, that sensory perception is in fact not primarily based on the external world, but is in fact primarily based on our minds, which is to say that what we perceive of the external world uh, is relies more on our thinking than on the actual external world. That's an extremely important possibility that Descartes is raising here. So there are reasons to be skeptical of this list. There are reasons to question it, but there are also reasons to defend it and to try to understand why Descartes includes these things. You know, and what he, I think if we give him a generous reading, what he's saying is that really all of our experience, even outside the project of radical doubt, even when we're living our lives normally, all of our experience is dependent upon, caused by, and shaped primarily by our minds. Right? So our experience is given to us by our minds. So again, I think the most important thing is sort of bringing down a barrier between purely mental acts and acts of perception, of sensory perception. And for someone like Plato, that barrier is going to be more extreme, even more so in the case of someone like Plotinus. Now, the other thing I want to mention about this section, which I think is interesting, is right, Descartes has just come from saying, I exist for as long as I am thinking. And then he goes on to explain that thinking consists in discrete acts. I doubt now, and now I understand. I affirm this, and I doubt or I deny that. Because thinking is broken down here into these discrete acts, singular acts, Descartes is presenting the possibility that our being as a thinking thing is in some sense discontinuous, right? I am now affirming this, and as I affirm it, I exist as a thinking thing. Then I move on to denying this next thing, and in my denial, I exist as a thinking thing. But between these two acts, there may be some separation, some gap in which I'm not thinking. And if I'm not thinking, then I don't exist. So, and this is something we'll see also at the beginning of the fourth meditation, Descartes is setting up a situation in which we don't exist, even as thinking things, between thought acts, between mental acts. Right? So maybe we'll just look at this quotation from the fourth meditation very quickly, where he says, on page 99, I realize that I am, as it were, something intermediate between God and nothingness, or between supreme being and non-being. My nature is such that insofar as I was created by the supreme being, there's nothing in me to enable me to go wrong or lead me astray. But insofar as I participate in nothingness or non-being, that is, insofar as I am not myself, the supreme being, it is no wonder that I make mistakes. So we'll come back to this. This is an extremely important passage, again, on page 99. But I want to sort of foreshadow that discussion here to mention that this is maybe one sense in which, although we exist, our existence as we understand it as a stable identity that is continuous through time may not be quite the way that we exist in reality. For Descartes, that our existence is in fact discontinuous rather than strictly continuous through time. Now, continuing with what it means to be a thinking thing, Descartes then wants to show what is possible for a thinking thing. So let me see. Sorry. Okay. On page 84, we get one of the most famous examples of the relation between thinking and perception in the history of philosophy. It's an example that I've used in class before. It's the example of the wax. So on 84, first full paragraph, he writes, "Let us consider the things which people commonly think they understand most distinctly of all. That is, the bodies which we touch and see. I do not mean bodies in general, for general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confused, but one particular body. What is it that we think we most fully understand? One particular body, right? I understand what this pencil is, right? There is nothing I understand better than the fact that this is a pencil which I hold in my hands. I know its form, I know its material, I know its shape. I have both a mental and a perceptual and sensory experience of this thing, right? It is unified, it is whole. If I don't understand the pencil, I don't understand anything. Right? So what we understand most of all is the particular that is right in front of us. So he goes on, let us take, for example, this piece of wax. It has just been taken from the honeycomb. It has not yet quite lost the taste of the honey. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, shape, and size are plain to see. It is hard, cold, and can be handled without difficulty. If you rap it with your knuckle, it makes a sound." Right? So enumerating the various sensory qualities of the wax. In short, it is everything which appears necessary to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. I know all of its attributes, I know all of its qualities, I can name them. If I don't know this, I don't know anything. But even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire and look, the residual taste is eliminated, the smell goes away, the color changes, the shape is lost, the size increases, it becomes liquid and hot, you can hardly touch it, and if you strike it, it no longer makes a sound. We've covered this example, right? We should be quite familiar with this problem by now. The idea that right, a particular thing can change its attributes, can change those things which we think are essential to knowledge about it, and yet remain the same. And the example of the wax is the most extreme or an extreme example because it so thoroughly transforms itself, right? Solid becomes a liquid. What is cool becomes hot. It moves from one set of opposites to another, right? If we want to go back to the very beginning, the problem of opposites with the pre-Socratics, how can something go from hot to cold, from solid to liquid, and still be the same thing? What is that sameness that transcends that change? So this is the problem. He concludes, right, yet the wax remains. Now, ultimately what Descartes is getting at here, and Descartes' solution to this problem, or the way he thinks about the problem, is the difference between matter itself and the forms that matter takes. Now that sounds like every philosopher that we've read. Every metaphysics makes a distinction between the material or the appearance and the form or idea, right? So what's different here? What's different is that Descartes is going to acknowledge that matter exists independently of form, and that matter in itself has certain properties. And those properties are the properties that can be known with the mind alone. Descartes is going to be fundamentally different and revolutionarily different than other philosophers by saying that, in fact, what the mind has access to is the nature of matter itself, not and that the form or idea of solid wax or liquid wax is less real and important than the matter that underlies both of those things. In order to understand the change from solid cool wax to hot liquid wax, we have to understand matter itself. The form is less important. So again, I said Descartes is a philosopher that is thinking about the sciences, right? He's looking for certainty in science, and he is responding to the Copernican revolution, the scientific revolution. He is trying to square philosophy with this new science, and this is a moment where Descartes is doing that. He's saying, right, what exists is not wax and pen, but a pure physicality that can make up wax and pen. That when we are asking about physics, we shouldn't be asking about forms, but we should be asking about materiality and the laws of materiality in general. Right? The particular thing is in some sense less real than abstract matter. And this is, I think, more familiar to us in our 21st century world, where we don't think about the study of physics and matter as the study of discrete bodies, but instead of atoms, of forces and of sort of microscopic matter and the forces that govern it, rather than bodies. So that's the shift that's taking place here, and that's going to be Descartes' idea. So he says, I must therefore admit, at the very bottom of 84 going into 85, I must therefore admit the nature of this piece of wax is no way revealed by my imagination, but is perceived by the mind alone. Now, what is this distinction between imagination and mind alone? The imagination is, interestingly, going to be that which gives us the different forms of the wax, right? The cool solid wax or the hot liquid wax. These, in some sense, belong to the imagination. How so? Right? Well, what is it that truly exists? Again, it is matter itself. If I'm going to study reality, I'm going to study those mathematical, physicalistic laws that govern matter itself. And those, although they may account for how matter becomes hot liquid wax or cool solid wax, are not going to be laws that are inherent to either the form of solid wax or liquid wax. That to say that what exists in the solid wax or liquid wax is wax is me taking a manifestation of matter as matter itself, one appearance of matter as matter itself. The manifestation of matter is a kind of imagination of what matter is. Right? I see matter as solid wax now, and to the extent that what is there is wax, that is my imagination. What is really there is the matter that is no more invested in solid wax than it is in liquid wax. So I think it might be useful to think about this in terms of something like geological time. Right? We, for example, might imagine that a mountain is eternal and unchanging because it never changes in our lifetime. The mountain is going to remain relatively the same throughout our whole life. And so we might be tempted to say that mountain is in immutable form. And it's true in our experience. That mountain is not going to change. That mountain is there. It's permanent. But in fact, that permanence is a symptom of our imagination. It's a symptom of our perspective, of our sensory capacities. If we were able to view the history of the planet from a God's eye perspective, we would see mountains rising and falling across the planet. Mountains are not permanent. Mountains very much come into and go out of existence. So, again, what truly exists is simply matter changing from one form to another. And to the extent that we think any of those forms that matter takes is real and permanent, that's just our imagination. That's a side effect of the limitations of our perceptual abilities. Right? So I'm not sure that's an illuminating example, but I think we can hopefully so. Let's discuss on Blackboard and in on office hours if we need to go back to that. But this is the shift that's taking place here. And so he goes on again on 85 here. But what is this wax which is perceived by the mind alone? It is, of course, the same wax which I see when I touch, which I picture in my imagination. In short, the same wax which I thought it to be from the start. And yet, here's my point, the perception I have of it is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. And this can be imperfect and confused as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how carefully I concentrate on what the wax consists in. So, what Descartes is saying is both cases, whether I regard the matter in itself as an abstract form, or, as an abstraction, or the form, solid or liquid, both of these are mental acts. In the case of form, it's a mental act because it's a kind of imagination, right? It's relative to my perspective. Now I see it in one form and then I see it in another form. And so that's shaped by my mentality to a being with a different perspective. You might say, there is no change from solid to liquid. Just as you might say, well, there is really no mountain. The mountain rises and falls. There is no mountain in a strict sense. There's just matter. And in the second sense, to the extent that I'm able to think about the pure matter, the abstract matter, that is also only a mental act, because, right, I don't experience matter itself. To the extent that I'm able to deduce that there is this material substratum that underlies both the solid and the liquid, that's an entirely abstract mental activity. So in both cases, my experience is shaped by my mind primarily. And here he also gives a kind of set of criteria for how to know when we are using our minds correctly, to not focus on the imagination, the imaginary sort of illusory form, solid or liquid, but to focus on pure abstract matter instead. So he says, let me highlight this again, this mental activity can be imperfect and confused. We think about the appearance, the imaginary aspect, or it can be clear and distinct as it is now. Now these are Descartes' criteria for knowing how to discern true knowledge from illusory knowledge or opinion or false knowledge, when I'm able to have a clear and distinct idea about it. And this is a phrase that Descartes will repeat over and over again. It's a much discussed phrase, right? A clear and distinct idea. Now, I don't have a clear and distinct idea of what wax is if I think that wax is solid and cool, right? Because as soon as it becomes liquid and hot, that idea no longer holds, and vice versa. So my ideas are imperfect and confused so long as I focus on those imaginary forms, but to the extent that I'm able to think about that underlying pure abstract matter, I'm able to have a more clear and distinct idea, right? I'll be able to have a sort of scientific analysis of what matter does, how matter behaves in both forms, in the solid and the liquid. So at that abstract level of analysis concerning matter in itself, you might say, that's where we're going to be able to have clear and distinct ideas. So again, this is a major reversal of the Platonic conception, where, and for that matter, Plotinus's conception, right, where the ideal form is more real than the underlying matter. Descartes says no, right? The only thing that we can have clear and distinct and scientific knowledge is with respect to matter itself, not the forms that matter takes. So you see, there's another interesting example of this at the bottom of this paragraph on 85, which illustrates just how little we actually get from our senses in terms of clear knowledge. And it's kind of an elaboration of why we should be doubtful about sensory knowledge to begin with. So it goes on. If I look out the window and see men crossing the square, as I just happened to have done, I normally say that I see men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. Yet do I see any more than hats and coats which could conceal automatons? I judge that they are men. And so something which I thought I was seeing with my eyes is in fact grasped solely by the faculty of judgment which is in my mind. Right? So what do I see when I look out on the street and see people? Right? So we have to imagine ourselves in the 17th century looking out the window, all the people are wearing hats and robes, right? We